This is Things Police See, First-Hand Accounts, with your host, Steve Gould.
Welcome to the podcast that interviews active and retired law enforcement about their most intense, bizarre, and sometimes humorous moments on the job. I am Steve Gould. I am Old Gingerface here for you. Thank you for being here, everybody. Love that you're here. Love that you've been listening and listening to all the episodes. It's funny how people listen. Some people, oddly, I got an email recently where the person started from the beginning, which is like almost 6 years ago now, or it is 6 years, and is working their way up. So they're commenting on interviews that like I haven't thought about in years. A lot of people start at the top. Any way you do it, I appreciate it. Just listen and hear the incredible stories the men and women law enforcement have from working in the field. That's the whole point of the show, to give you a better appreciation for what it is they actually do by hearing the true stories, unedited, how they live them. Guys, before we get started, I have a message to my fellow officers and police agencies out there that listen to the show. I want to tell you about an incredible disabled veteran-owned business, Black Box Safety. They've just been awarded a nationwide contract through Sourcewell to provide point-blank body armor to law enforcement agencies across the country. All agencies receive a 38% discount on point-blank vests, shields, and helmets. Get your team geared up with the most advanced ballistic protection customized for your department. To learn more, head over to blackboxsafety.com or drop them an email at sourcewell@blackboxsafety.com or connect with them on Instagram at blackboxsafety. All this will be in the show notes. No reason to memorize it. It's a fantastic deal they have going on, and my agency actually uses Point Blank, and they are the best IMO. So thank you, Black Box. And now to the show. Really interesting guest, really diverse and interesting background. Got it. I'm sure the conversation is going to go into a lot of wild different directions because he's done a lot of different stuff. He is former deportation officer with Immigration and Customs Enforcement and special agent with Department of Homeland Security, Office of Inspector General. Now works as motivational speaker and keynote speaker for law enforcement events and industry conferences. In his book, In Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders, he shares the lessons he speaks about publicly. Let me bring on the great Kristofor Healey. Kristofor.
How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. It seems like you're in a bunker or something.
Yeah, this is where I like to record. I have a master bedroom closet where I keep all my guns and all my old law enforcement stuff too. So it makes a nice backdrop, but it's also probably the best sound quality you're going to get in this house.
The quality, it's nice, nicely insulated. I see the gun safe. I see an old duty belt hanging up. Yeah. I see maybe a couple
of raid jackets there. Yeah.
Yep, a digital couple handgun safes on the top. You're my kind of guy.
I gotta stay strapped.
Yeah, absolutely. I got up on my bureau now. I have first of all, I have gun lockers in both mine and my wife's car. I got her a license to carry. I have a fingerprint one in the bedroom on the bureau. And then I have a big gun safe downstairs. I got them if I had more money, I would have the ones that go in the wall and they just kind of pop out and you can grab them like a real nut job. But I don't have the funds quite yet.
Yeah, I moved out to the country, and I assume that all of my neighbors who are living in the big houses out here are also well armed. And so we're basically an enclave, kind of a little militia northwest of Houston.
Oh yeah. In Texas, man, it would be like Red Dawn if anybody tried to come in there and cause trouble. Just everybody'd have a gun.
For sure. That's a good Gen X reference that I appreciate.
It's funny. Sometimes when we sit down and watch TV, and I know parents with kids go through this. We have a wide range, 15 to a 4-year-old. So it's really hard to find something that you can watch. And my memory of 80s movies is way off. I'll be like, yeah, we can watch that. And right away, there's either swearing, Lord's name in vain, or boobs. And I'm like, gosh. I remember why 12-year-old Steve liked this movie. But, Gen Xers raised by boomers, I was not watched. It was kind of like,
no.
Oh, he's watching HBO at midnight. It's probably fine. It's like, no, I'm watching Real Sex 35.
I was having a conversation with my wife last night about our 12-year-old. She's got a birthday coming up, and we were kind of stressing out about the party because nowadays you can't just have her 5 friends come over and have a sleepover and watch movies and have popcorn. The parents insist on staying for the duration. So it's you're not just entertaining the children, you've got to bring the parents in. And I was like, you know what I did for my 10th birthday party? Weekend at Bernie's came out in September of 1989.
Nice.
I turned 10 years old that month. it was like the hot, funny movie. My mom dropped my friends and I off at the movie theater, gave us, like $20 or whatever to buy tickets and popcorn, and left us to watch that movie by ourselves. Now, if you go back and watch that, it's a PG-13 rating. But like within the first 10 minutes of the movie, there's a guy getting like, shot up with heroin by the mob and killed. It's
Yeah,
like, I mean,
I
I don't
know.
know if the rating system changed or what, but we were kind of laughing about that because it just seems like life has life has changed quite a bit in
Oh,
30,
yeah.
35 years.
It so has, and it's there's always in your mind you're always like, wait, am I being that person where it's like I feel like I don't want my kid to ride their bike into town because it's so dangerous, yet I was doing it my whole childhood, or is it in fact there are more crashes, there are more perverts, you know what I mean? Like there does seem to be more wild stuff. Like I used to get dropped off. I think we're the exact same age. If you were 10 and 89, we're the same age. I used to get dropped off at a local movie theater that had like a double or triple feature for the whole day.
Right.
So essentially like the ladies that worked at the movie theater, now part of their job was like a pack of 10-year-olds like running around like, okay guys, the movie's starting, get in there. Like they had to mother us all day because we were watching the movies, you know?
Yeah, we're watching things like Young Guns 2 and like, I
Yep.
mean, I learned a lot about life at the movie theater unsupervised. And I assume other feral Gen Xers like me who grew up on hose water and duck and cover drills and all that stuff is the same. So I don't think that there are necessarily more perverts or more accidents or more crazy stuff. I think we just hear about it more because we're more connected than we've ever been, and I think that has kind of caused that generational change. I also think 9/11 has a lot to do with it. That was a real sea change moment for our generation because that was as we were hitting young adulthood,
Yeah.
and we grew up with the specter of terrorism and the fear of terrorism and those sort of events that we probably never really thought about. I mean, Columbine happened when I was in college, then
Yeah.
9/11, and I think those kind of combined our generation of parenting is probably a lot different than the boomers that raised us because the world seems a lot less innocent after those things start happening.
Yeah, and like the mental health epidemic that's going on and all that. Geez, one more memory of childhood movies. My dad, mom wanted to go out to eat once when I was younger, and I don't know why. I don't know where my sister went, but I got sent to my uncle's house who lived behind us, and he just drives truck. Great dude. I love him to death and love having a beer with him to this day. But just a rough and tumble dude. Always had a German Shepherd. Pretty much was never married. Just a rough and tumble dude. And he's like, "Yeah, what do you want to watch?" So we ended up watching like one of the Death Wish movies, and I'm like 8, and anytime like a rape scene came on, and there was a few, I just had to cover my eyes, like don't look. So he tells my dad when he comes to pick me up, he's like, "Oh, what'd you guys do?" He's like, "We watched a couple movies." I'm like, "We watched Death Wish." My dad's like, "Oh, that's a pretty rough movie." And my uncle's like, "I had him cover his eyes during the bad stuff." Well, Uncle Jay never watched me again after that.
Right. That's just life for us. I think it's funny. Somebody was telling me that we're the generation that just again we were raised feral. We were raised on after school snacks and hose water and all of that stuff. And
Right.
Not to say my parents did a bad job; they did an awesome job. But
Yeah.
it was a different world. And I not to get political about it, but somebody told me like the election this year was a reflection of Gen X rising up and telling the world, leave us alone, because
Yeah.
we've been left alone and we just want to be left alone. And I thought that was a pretty accurate reflection of kind of like how things have shifted over the last 5 years and how our generation has been like, enough, leave us alone.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%, man. Kristofor, so you have a very diverse or very interesting, and you did a lot of different jobs in law enforcement, it seems like, different agencies. And you were a special agent. So, of course, these questions aren't going to be exactly right, but do you have, or exactly pertain to like what you did maybe, but you'll do your best with we'll do our best conforming the questions. I've already talked about the questions too much. Okay. So the first call or case that you had where you had like an adrenaline dump where you were like, really got your heart going.
Whew. I mean, there were a lot, but probably the one that stands out the most was probably the first time I realized I could have been killed. And, I think we've all had that moment where after the fact, you just are freezing cold because the adrenaline dump and everything that just happened. I got a call. So you mentioned I was a special agent. I worked on the southwest border. So deep South Texas, McAllen, Texas. It's in the news. It's been in the news a lot over the last few years because it's kind of been where a lot of the Central Americans cross. It's one of the closest points to the Northern Triangle. So whenever there's a big surge in immigration, you see a ton of traffic coming through the Rio Grande Valley. And that's where I spent 10 years of my career. I was there during what was called the unaccompanied alien surge. So this would have been about 2014 or so, when there was a loophole in immigration law where the smugglers realized we can drop kids off at the border, we can get them through, and ICE and the federal agencies will reconnect them with family members in the United States. It makes it a lot more profitable for us, and they can't be deported because there's all these rules about them being held and all of this stuff. It created this giant mess, 2014, 2015. The numbers seem quaint now, looking back on them based on what we've seen over the last 4 years, but we're getting like 50,000 kids a month coming across the border.
Whoa.
It was a ton. And these are all kids like, I mean, I've got a 10-year-old and a soon-to-be 12-year-old. These are kids like 5, 6 years old and younger that are just parents putting them in the hands of coyotes, right? And so in the midst of all this, there was a lot of corruption that bubbled up because Border Patrol has their hands tied. They're just overwhelmed with this. The smugglers just took this loophole and just drove a Mack truck through it. So we've just got just an absolute crisis on our hands. This is when they start building the quote unquote cages. They start putting up these temporary facilities, housing facilities. And
wait, I thought Donald Trump built those cages personally.
Yeah, believe it or not, they were actually built by his predecessor, and I was in them in 2014, 2015. So I can confirm that they were not in fact built by a guy who wasn't president at the time.
Right.
But yeah, so we would get these calls, of all sorts of events involving smugglers, involving children, horrible stuff, and I'm responding largely to allegations that a Border Patrol agent did something wrong, right? Like maybe there was a death in custody, or maybe there was a body that was found, or maybe there was a incident involving a use of force that needed to be investigated. And that was typically what I was getting. One night I get a call from a Border Patrol supervisor that I had done a fair amount of internal affairs work with. And I could tell, because this call came directly from him, I was on duty. Normally duty calls got routed through the ops center and would get kind of filtered out to the different agencies. And I would be used to getting those calls all night long. It was a lot of CYA stuff. Border Patrol agent lost his night vision goggles, or, a dog bite, right, or whatever. This one came directly from a supervisor. And he says, listen, we just picked up 2 women about a mile away from each other in separate incidents. Our guys just reported that they picked up 2 women with slash wounds on their wrists, both of whom are claiming that they were picked up by a Border Patrol agent, sexually assaulted, and then left for dead. And they're claiming that there was a 3rd woman with them. And what was happening at the time is coyotes were telling people, just cross the border, wait for the green and white truck to pick you up. They're going to drive you to the station. They're going to process you, give you a permiso, basically what's called a notice to appear, which would basically say, come back for court at a later date, and then they're free to move about the country.
I promise.
I promise. I'll come back. And you can imagine, like most of them, bye.
Right.
So, like 99 out of 100 never came back for that court date. So there was no real effort to hide from Border Patrol at the time, because they were getting these kind of free to move about the country passes, because we just had they were so overwhelmed, similar to what's been happening over the last few years. Well, these women got dropped off. None of them had been in the country before. They were from Honduras. It was an adult and 2 minors that were with her daughter and another minor, both like teenagers. And they waited at a spot where Border Patrol was typically picking people up. They were kind of just running a route back and forth from the station to this area. And an agent came up in what we call a kilo unit, one of those like Border Patrol, you can look this up, like Border Patrol trucks with kind of like almost like the cooler on the back, kind of like a paddy wagon sort of thing. And loads these people in, and these people are like obviously a little bit nervous, but they're expecting they're going to go to the station, they're going to get their permisos. He gets them in the vehicle, drives them down the road a little bit, gets them out of the vehicle, duct tapes their hands. Now, this is obviously not how we do things. We use handcuffs, sometimes zip ties, but we don't use duct tape. And then takes them further down the road, kind of drives around a little bit. They're disoriented. They don't have windows in the back of this unit. And long story short, he stops at different intervals, takes first the mother out, assaults her, slices her wrists, tries to break her neck, throws her into the brush. She plays dead. He covers her up with brush, does it to her daughter a little bit later, and then disappears from the scene. Third woman is nowhere to be found. Now,
Wow.
these two women, all the guts in the world. I mean, they like get up. They both like go and flag down another border patrol unit driving by.
Yeah, which could be
terrified
risky
as they
after
are,
that.
which could
Yeah.
be extremely risky. But they're scared for their lives. They're bleeding. They're hurt. Fortunately, these were good guys. They bring him to the hospital, and then they find out in the hospital this is a mother and daughter. They both got brought there panicking about what happened to the other one. And so that's when the Border Patrol supervisor calls me. And our thoughts initially were, hey, the coyotes often mock up Border Patrol vehicles to make it easier for them to smuggle people in. Coyotes are notorious for sexually assaulting the people that they're moving. You've probably heard of rape trees and things like that. These are real things. A lot of times they will hold people and they will threaten their families to send more money, or they're going to be sexually assaulted or hurt or killed. And so our initial reaction was this had to be a coyote. But the more these women talked, the more they described the uniform the guy was wearing, the more they described how he had his radio, the more they described the inside of the kilo unit, the stamped metal pattern on the inside, the more obvious it became to the supervisor that this was an actual agent who had done this, not a coyote driving a mocked up vehicle.
Wow.
And so he calls me kind of terrified. He's like, I don't know what to do here. What do I do? We're getting ready. You know, day shift just ended. Swing shift is here. We're getting ready to release, or sorry, swing shift just ended. We're getting ready to release vehicles out for the night shift. What do you want me to do? And so I said, listen, let me make a couple of calls. Let me get some people heading your way. I'm about an hour away. I covered I forget how many miles of the border, but I covered it could take me 2 hours to get to a duty call sometimes. So I was like, I'm on my way, but call these other people first. And here's what I want you to do. Get this off the radio. Because if this is really a Border Patrol agent, they take their radios home. He's listening. He's hearing the traffic. He knows that he's about to get exposed because these women didn't die. All of that stuff's rushing through my head.
Right.
So I called up the local FBI office, the local HSI office, get all the assets heading towards McAllen. He calls. I said, listen, before you release any vehicles for the shift, grab a couple of supervisors you trust. Keep them quiet. Keep this off the radio. Go out and triage the vehicles that you're getting ready to release that came in off of day shift, and see if there's anything in there that backs up this story. See if you can find duct tape or blood or anything. He calls me back. I'm in the car. I told my wife, this is one of those where she'll always remember, do not wait up for me. This is going to be a late night. I'm not going to be able to touch base. I'm not going to be able to call you. I'm going. That was
Right.
it. I couldn't really tell her what was happening. He calls me back 5 minutes later. I'm in the car. He's like, you're not going to believe it. The first vehicle we opened up, we found duct tape. We found blood. We found exactly what we would expect to find to confirm this story.
Damn.
And so I take off, running code all the way to the Border Patrol station, meet there, FBI's there. We're all gathered in the supervisor's office. None of us have worked together, but we've got the personnel file of the guy who was driving that vehicle. And the guy's name, you can look him up. His name is Esteban Manzanares. He was a Border Patrol agent. He was, 5-6 years on the job, kind of middle of the pack guy, wasn't a dope hound, didn't have a kind of a name for being a big sign cutting guy or dope hound or anything. He was just middle of the pack kind of guy that was reliable and did his job. And we found out he lived in an apartment complex about 1.5 miles from the Border Patrol station, where a bunch of other CBP employees, guys who worked at the bridge, guys who worked Border Patrol, all kind of clustered in this condo complex. And we kind of real quick got on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We realized we have exigent circumstances to take the door because there's this third person missing. We think he might have her. At the time, we get some camera footage from some of the game camera activity that they have down there. Texas DPS has game cameras set up on the smuggling trails. And
Okay.
we see another vehicle going back into the area where these women were assaulted. It was like a silver pickup truck and leaving. And we're like, what does he drive? And we look it up. Sure enough, he drives a silver pickup truck. We're like, okay, so what we think happened is he took the third girl out of the vehicle, left her, turned in his Border Patrol unit, came back in his personal vehicle, picked her up, and brought her maybe to his apartment.
Oh,
so we sent some
geez.
uniforms over. They confirmed that the vehicles that we know he has are parked at the condo. We know that his phone is pinging in that vicinity because we get an emergency ping. We do all of that stuff, and it's about maybe 2 hours from the time this call happens, and we're like, okay, we've had the helicopter up looking for heat sensors. It's a cold night in March. We should be able to find something if there's a body out there. Nothing. We're trying to keep it off the radio, but it's Border Patrol station is probably like any police station. It's just sewing circle, right?
Oh, yeah.
Whispers and text messages,
Yeah.
and so we're exposed. we go in. We couldn't find a SWAT team. We called like FBI. Their HRT is up in San Antonio, so they couldn't get there in the time that we needed. It's like a Tuesday night in March. I mean, we've got some local SWAT assets, but they're all guys who are like, like might be the school resource officer, but also on the SWAT team, that sort of thing. Where,
Sure.
it's not the guys you want necessarily leading the charge. Good guys, good cops, but they're going to have to pull those assets together too and debrief. We just don't have time at this point. We realize more than likely there is a kidnapped girl in this apartment and we've got to go get her. And so we grab the 6 or 8 guys that we've got. We come up with a quick TAC plan. We get the U.S. Attorney's Office to give us their blessing. We head on over there. And the goal is we're going to hit that door. And it's like 2 FBI agents, then me, my partner, and a couple HSI people. We're going to hit that door. We're going to flood the space. It's like a 3-room apartment. We've got a schematic from the apartment manager. We're going to flood that zone and we're going to try to recover this girl. But speed is our asset at this point. Surprise is our asset. We're assuming that maybe he knows.
Kristofor, did they make you get a warrant for this, or did they let you just go on the probable cause?
It was exigent at that point. They basically said, go take the door. And that never happened to me in my career either. Like, I'm used to being, as a special agent, I'm used to working long, slow build-up cases.
Sure.
By the time we're doing an enforcement action, I've been investigating the case for 5-6 months, whatever the case may be. This was, no, you've articulated well enough exactly why there's a person in danger in that place.
That's great. Less paperwork, the better.
Yeah, well, we end up getting up to the door. So we all get in and, we've got the uniforms kind of, there's 2 entrances to the condo complex. They're watching the gates, making sure the guy doesn't leave. We roll in. And the plan is for us to flood the zone and for 2 uniform vehicles to pull in, turn their lights and sirens on behind us, because our big fear is, again, there's a civil war happening between the Gulf Cartel about 1.5 miles south of us in Tamaulipas. And there's a bunch of Border Patrol agents and CBP officers living in this complex. They start, God forbid, guns start going off. They start seeing like an action where a bunch of guys, like civilian clothes with body armor on, are kicking down the door of one of their colleagues. We're worried about taking incoming from people who are scared, thinking there's like a cartel action happening.
Oh, man.
And so we're going to roll up to the door. 2 uniforms are going to pull up behind us. They're going to turn their lights and sirens on as we hit the door. Well, as all good plans do, this one falls apart pretty quickly. We get out. Everybody quietly approaches. We're parked way down the parking lot. We quietly approach. And it's a first floor unit with windows on the parking lot. And then the door is kind of around the corner. So we kind of have to snake around the windows to stack up. And as we roll around the windows, as I said, none of us have ever dealt with one of these situations where we're just going to take a door with exigency. And so what happens when you get in that stressful situation? You get stuck in that OODA loop, and your mind starts doing it starts reverting to your training. And what does training teach us time and time and time again is to knock and announce. So instead of getting up to the door and the Ram guy who is second in the stack taking the door and us flooding in, the guy at the lead of the stack hits the door and bang, bang, bang. FBI, Esteban, open up. And it was like an accordion, like everybody just kind of collapsed on each other because we were expecting that door to pop open. We were just like, oh my God. All of a sudden I realized, I look to my left and I'm just exposed. Like there's a window, there's nothing between me and this window.
Hanging in the wind.
10 feet away from me, just hanging in the wind. And it felt like minutes. It was seconds, but it felt like forever. And instead of stepping out of the way, he goes to bang on the door. And as he starts to hit the door the second time, we hear the gunshot. And that's when the wildest thing happened. I go back to my training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. We were doing basically search warrants. We were doing these sort of preps, taking a door, going in. And they have role players in there, and they do all sorts of things to mess with you and screw you up so that they can see how you react. A lot of that is with simunitions. So you're figuring out what happens when you come through a door and how likely you are to get hit and all that. And I went back to my training, and one of my instructors said, he was kind of briefing the 6 of us up. He said, listen, anytime we do a search warrant, we have to have a bug out word. So you guys come up with a word among yourselves, and that word is the key for everyone else in your unit to back out, to tactically withdraw. I hadn't used this word in my entire career, going back, but the word was avalanche. And so in that moment, you hear the gunshot, and what comes into my head? I grab the shoulder of the guy in front of me. I say, avalanche, avalanche, avalanche. We didn't brief on this. We didn't talk on this. everyone knew exactly what it meant. It was just like, back away, get out. And so we get out, we set up behind those two marked units that pulled in behind us, which actually kind of created a problem because now we have to get around them and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then we settle in, we try to raise the guy on the phone, cover's blown. Like, we're not going to be able to take this by surprise. We're worried about what's happening with the girl in there. Guy doesn't answer. We get back on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office to say, hey, bring SWAT in. This guy's now a barricaded subject, not answering his phone. He's fired a gun. We don't know if he's taken his own life, if it was a warning shot.
Right.
Long story short, hang on a sec. Sorry.
No problem.
Long story short, we get a phone call saying SWAT's on its way. We stand down. They take the door. They do their rah-rah thing. They, rake the window, throw the flashbangs in. They go in. They recover the girl. She's in the back bedroom, tied to a bed, duct-taped mouth.
Oh, my gosh.
Otherwise unharmed. Now, she's been assaulted and all that stuff, but otherwise unharmed. But the guy is slumped over dead at his kitchen table, which is right next to those windows. And what occurs to me is, and he had taken his own life. What occurs to me is, he sat there waiting. He probably knew we were coming. He had probably heard the radio traffic. His radio's sitting on the table in front of him. And I'm sitting there thinking, the FBI agent screwed up by banging on the door. What I think happened was some divine intervention. He wanted suicide by a cop, I think, and he was waiting for us to come through that door and start shooting. And when he paused and banged on the door and said, open the door, that gave him the option to check out instead.
Yeah.
And
wow.
I think how easy it would have been for him to just rake that window first.
Oh, yeah.
And so when I walked in, when SWAT took the door, we're right behind him. I walk in, I see the body there. Just like all the blood ran out of me. Because it was like my worst nightmare. It was like, you were this close. Like, this guy just by choosing to hit the door the way he did, and this guy choosing to swing his gun towards his temple instead of the window. I mean, fraction of a second, everything could have changed. And so that's a long way to say that was probably the scariest moment I ever endured, or the scariest realization I ever had. I mean, you can get in fights and you can look back on them and be like, well, that could have gone bad.
No, great story.
Nothing matches that.
Great story, man. You told it really well too. Damn. So it always I know I shouldn't be because I've been in law enforcement 19 years and I should never be shocked by people lying to me or whatever, but I always am. And I'm always shocked by a cop like this that's going under the radar, obviously passed an extensive background, a psychological, all the stuff, but had this demon living in him. Had this evilness and was capable of doing this type of thing. Was there any, when you guys looked in the background, was there anything that popped up that could have kind of pointed towards him, this kind of behavior?
No, he was a veteran too. He had, and so that was the other thing we kind of approached, knowing this guy, he's armed, he's got a radio, he's got some tactical training from Border Patrol, same training that we've got.
Yeah.
He's also got military service in his background. He had deployed to Afghanistan once. He scrawled a quick suicide note, and it was just, it was gibberish. It was, it was basically blamed his army service. I've had evil thoughts since I got back from deployment, but it didn't really track with anything in his file. He'd never really been in any trouble. So it's one of those where that haunts me a little bit, because I'll go back to post 9/11. After 9/11, we about doubled the size of the Border Patrol. And during that time, after 9/11, we called a mass hiring. There was a period from about 2004, let's say, when Homeland Security was stood up and they reopened all of these positions. They had kind of put a hiring freeze in while they reorganized the government and created Homeland Security. And then they dumped 20,000 people into the system. And a lot of things changed in how people were hired. Now, I'm not saying that led to a huge uptick in public corruption, but it let people in who probably otherwise wouldn't have, because we started allowing people before, the way it worked prior to 9/11. If you wanted to work for the Border Patrol, you would apply for a job, and if you were from, say, Brownsville, Texas, they would send you to San Diego, California. Or if you're from San Diego, they'd send you to El Paso. You were not going to be allowed to work in an area where it was likely you had friends and family on both sides of the border, because it just made you more, I guess, I don't want to say corruptible, because 99.9% of these guys are on the up and up all the time.
But you might have too much empathy for someone you run in with.
You might run into, a high school buddy of yours who's now on the other side of the law, who's running dope or whatever. They just didn't want to put you in a situation where your ethics could be challenged or you could be compromised.
Yeah, it makes
And
sense.
what would happen is, 2 to 3 years in, you hit a seniority status, you can transfer back. But they wanted you to have that time where you're learning the ropes in a less controversial environment, I guess.
Sure.
An area where you're less likely to be compromised while you're still on those lower rungs of the ladder. After 9/11, they kind of did away with that because they needed bodies and they needed them quickly because we had this new threat that we hadn't really considered before. So all of a sudden, if you're from Brownsville, you can stay in Brownsville. If you're from Laredo, you can stay in Laredo, et cetera, et cetera. And what ended up happening is the cartels saw this and they took advantage of it. They said, we've got individuals who have clean criminal records who are associated with our organizations, and we can start seeding the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection with our people, kind of like in The Departed. It's very similar. Like
Sure.
they just were like placing people in law enforcement agencies, sending them through the academies. And these people came out of the academies and went back to work looking the other way on dope loads, helping aliens get across,
Yep.
doing things like that. And so I was very busy in the early days of my career as a special agent working those sort of cases, because whenever a high-level cartel member would get captured or would get extradited, the quickest way for them to start working off some time on their sentence was to start giving up the assets that they had cultivated that were operating within DHS. So these people were extremely valuable working for the cartel, but then they were extremely valuable, as assets if you were arrested as well. There was no indication this guy had any association with the cartel. No association that any of this was, a plant. But we looked at that. We thought maybe this is what it could be, because we've seen this quite a bit. No. But also, again, at that same time, this guy came in during that mass hiring. There was no poly. There were a lot of other things that a lot of gaps, I guess, in the system they've since closed that probably would prevent this from happening again.
Yeah, and that's a big. Unfortunately, that's something we're going to be seeing in police work nationally. And it was happening when I was a background investigator for LAPD for a couple of years, and that's just what's happening. It's like we need bodies, and our standards are too high. We're just not getting the people we need to. Either pay way more money, which they're not willing to do, or lower your standards. So that's kind of the choices. And agencies, governments always nobody wants to pay cops. So they're always if they can tweak this system to get more people in. And that was a huge problem with me and the other background investigators was a huge problem would be if they were totally comfortable with in some circumstances, it's a not recommend from me. I'm the guy that worked this file for 2 months. I do not recommend. Guy makes it. And you're like, wow. Okay. And one of those guys was Kristofor Dorner, who he was a do not recommend that got passed by admin. Because the first thing any of us would do is if an officer at LAPD did something really screwed up, who was his background guy? That's all we cared about. We're like, who did his background? But in Dorner's case, and his background investigator was actually on his list. He worked 3 cubicles down from me. He was on the kill list.
Wow.
Because he
was LAPD or LA Sheriff's Office?
LAPD.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So it's not a good thing, but man, that's a hell of a story and insane. I thought it was going to end with you saying it was a painted up. I was hoping in my heart that it was going to be a painted up van or whatever that wasn't part of the good guys, but
no. And that was one that that was the first time a case I had. There was a lot going on in my career at that time. It was kind of a perfect storm. So at that same time, I was involved in an investigation that became known as the Panama Unit investigation. We were investigating a group of corrupt Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office police that were basically ripping off dope loads and reselling them, kind of like Training Day, but in real life. And they were escorting other dope loads through the county and doing all that stuff. The guy who was in charge of that unit was the son of the Hidalgo County Sheriff. And so this is all happening at that same time. We're in the midst of this investigation, and the sheriff kind of is aware of what's going on. So that night, we of course needed extra assets. We had Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office out there securing the crime scenes where these 2 girls had been assaulted. We have their their unit come in to secure the vehicle and do all the crime scene, evidence collection of the vehicle, because we're all out there on the tactical side of things. He gets out there in front of the video cameras and makes himself the big hero of the incident, and starts like a lot of the information that's out in the public record about this stems from a lawsuit that was filed by these women against the U.S. government after the fact, and then the statements that he made that night. He was out there giving details about the investigation as we still hadn't gotten into the apartment. He's out there in front of television.
Why would you
cameras,
do that?
burnishing his image, because he knows he's well aware that he's being looked at for corruption as well. And so that was going on. And then on top of that same exact week that happened, I had been in federal court down in Brownsville, Texas, testifying against my former special agent in charge in a corruption case. And so it was quite a week for me.
And he ended up getting arrested, and did he go to jail?
He did 37 months in BOP.
Whoa.
So I blew the whistle on something happening in my own office in 2011, and it all came to a head with a trial in March of 2014, the same time that this incident happened. So, it was a tough one.
What was he doing?
The stupidest crime imaginable. He was a fairly new manager. So the way it works in the federal government, small agencies like mine, you have annual inspections, and they send in a team from Washington, D.C. to make sure that your office is following the special agent handbook. Your file room is 10-8, your armory, everything's squared away, all that stuff. And he was fairly new. This was his first inspection that was coming up. And as a manager, again, during this time when there's a ton of corruption allegations, there's a lot going on, we are overwhelmed. He's opening up way too many case files instead of taking the cases that have the most meat on the bone. Any allegation coming in of a corruption incident involving a DHS employee, he's opening up and assigning the file. So an effective criminal investigator can maybe work 5 or 6 investigations at a time. And even then, you're really kind of like working one, and the rest of them you're just kind of keeping going a little bit. But
right.
We had at the time, the 9 guys in my office had like 20 files on our desk at any given time. And so things weren't moving very quickly. And he realized the inspectors are going to come down and they're going to slap him on the wrist pretty hard for mismanagement, for, poor decision making, for, the morale issues that caused and all the problems. And so in advance of this inspection, he got a couple of guys together in the office who were really keen on promoting, guys who were eyeing the assistant special agent in charge position that was going to be vacant in the next couple of years because he was nearing retirement. He got a couple of those guys together and basically said to them, like, you're my guys. And in advance of this inspection, I want you to take some of these files that we know they've identified files they want to look at. I want you to take some of these files. I want you to put some stuff in them to make it look like more is happening in these investigations than is.
Oh, boy.
I was a young, rookie agent. I had no idea this was going on. I just walked to the break room one morning to refill my coffee cup. And the conference room where he is having this discussion with these agents is right adjacent to the break room. They didn't know I was in there refilling my coffee cup, but I just overheard this conversation where he's literally instructing criminal investigators to falsify records in ongoing cases.
How stupid.
Ongoing criminal investigations. I overhear this. I'm like, what the hell am I supposed to do with this information? So when the inspectors came down, I told them what I overheard. I said, hey, pay attention to these files. I know you pre-selected these 15 files. Look at these files closely because this is what I overheard. And sure enough, they looked at the files and they started asking questions, and they found that's exactly what he had done. And FBI got involved. They ended up bringing in a public corruption unit from D.C. And strangely enough, a name you might know was in charge of the public corruption unit at the time, a guy named Jack Smith.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those who don't know, that's the special prosecutor that the Biden administration had running the investigations into President Trump. He was at the time in charge of the public corruption unit up in D.C. And he had a bunch of young, hard-charging attorneys. They weren't afraid to get, they weren't afraid to lose cases. They weren't afraid to get overturned in court. They were really pushing, as he has done, in his post-government career. They weren't afraid to push the boundaries of the letter of the law. And they came in hard and fast, and they indicted not only my boss, but they actually indicted one of my colleagues, and they ended up having to throw that case out because they screwed up. They misidentified him as having falsified records when he never did.
Oh,
And so
jeez.
it got real ugly for the next 3 years, and I ended up having to testify against my boss. He ended up getting 36 months, and another one of my colleagues went to jail for a year, and two of my colleagues got fired. And so it was an ugly time early in my career that kind of preceded and led up to that incident with the shooting.
Well, good for you though, man. I mean, that is not easy to do, being in a situation like that, especially when you're new. But also those shiny new ethics that you were taught at the academy are still pretty fresh. You know what I mean? And you're expecting to go into I'm a special agent. We're on the up and up. This is all, and to see that it must have been a shock to your system. Like, what the hell?
Yeah, not only that, but I was working for the Office of Inspector General, which is internal affairs for Homeland Security, right? Our job was to look into corrupt Border Patrol agents, for instance.
Oh, the irony. It's terrible.
Kidnapping. Yeah, the irony. And so we had been told, and I applied for that job because when I worked for ICE, when I was a deportation officer, I became aware of a group of contract security guards who were smuggling dope into one of the ICE facilities. And I worked with an informant to identify and uncover who these guards were. And I brought that information to the Office of Inspector General. And that was their basis for hiring me. They were like, this guy's great. He's got sterling ethics. He helped us uncover this.
A real Serpico here.
Yeah, exactly. So as soon as they had an opening, I was looking for special agent jobs. I wanted to go to FBI or DEA or whoever was hiring at the time, and they said, "Hey, listen, why don't you come work for us? We'd love to have you." And so that was the basis to hire me. And then within a year of being hired, I end up uncovering corruption in my own office, in my own internal affairs office.
I'm refilling your coffee. You're like, this isn't that hard.
Yeah, it was something else. And I tell people, if the Rio Grande Valley didn't exist, like in real life, people wouldn't believe it if it was a Hollywood movie. I mean, it's an incredible place. It's a beautiful place with wonderful people, but it's also some of the most incredible stories of public corruption you're ever going to hear because of the close proximity to the border. And I think what happened with my boss was that, that becomes such a mainstream thing in the community down there and in law enforcement circles, kind of going along to get along and doing things that you shouldn't be doing. I think it just became easy for him to just kind of fall into that pattern.
Yeah, I can see that. Kristofor, can you tell us about a strange or bizarre thing you dealt with?
A lot of strange and bizarre things. I mean, it's always strange and bizarre to work on a border where you've got just another country and culture and everything happening. And so, it was always interesting. You'd go and do these search warrants and you'd find the Jesus Malverde, like shrine or the Santísima Muertes shrine and stuff like that. That just gives you the creeps because you realize like this is a guy who's like dabbling in the occult, and that stuff
super
was
pagan stuff.
It was creepy stuff. That was pretty common. And just like the kind of stuff that you don't hear about on the news, but you should hear about on the news, where individuals are being trafficked by coyotes, and you cross the border, and then you've got this big stretch of ranch land, these privately owned ranches in Texas.
Yeah,
like
I've
King
heard about
Ranch,
that.
they're like the size of King Ranch is bigger than the state of Rhode Island. So you've got this entire massive expanse of brushland between the border and where you start to get into places like Corpus Christi, Houston, San Antonio. And a lot of the worst things that coyotes and traffickers do is out in that brushland, because if people can't keep up with the group, they leave them. And so you find in small counties like Brooks County, Texas, off the border, they were finding hundreds of bodies a year abandoned in the ranch land. And then those counties have to deal with interring those bodies, trying to identify those bodies. It was literally bankrupting counties. So some of
I bet
the creepiest stuff that I had to deal with was, you're being called to Brooks County because Border Patrol found a body out in the middle of nowhere, and they maybe have an ID and they're trying to identify who this person is. And, that sort of stuff lives with you. You start to see, you see people who've been torn apart by animals and, left for dead. It's horrible.
Man, yeah, that is crazy. Yeah, I've heard about those ranchers who essentially have to like be their own border patrol. Like they're out there on horseback with, like mini 14s, like having their ranch hands patrol they probably just patrol the piece of the property that matters to them. They're probably not out in the brush, but that is, I don't know I could live like that. Like living, I'm sure they have nice houses on those parcels of land, but like any moment someone could come through your door. I mean, these people, they're rightfully desperate. They could be starving. Like they're not in their right mind, and you're living right there in that house. Like that would drive me nuts.
Yeah, my wife's family owns, they're farmers in Willacy County, Texas, so a little bit, maybe 100 miles off the border, and in that kind of area. And they're dryland cotton farmers, and they have people cross their property all the time, and they have good relationships with Border Patrol, and they report what they see. But they've had people come up to their like back door, like in absolute desperate straits, like dying of thirst, or they've caught people eating dog food for like their dog bowls on their back porch. Like they've caught people like eating dog food because they're literally dying. And they'll go out there and they'll give them water and sustenance. They'll call Border Patrol and they'll try to get them turned over to someone who can help them. But if you can't keep up with the group, you're left. That's it.
That's terrible.
And there's an untold toll, not just on the human toll of it. When you have an open border, it encourages more people to come, and when you have more people coming across, more people are going to die on that very dangerous journey. And so there's nothing kind or gentle or humanitarian about an open border. It leads to more death and destruction, not just when people get to their destinations, and we have things like what happened to Lake and Riley or other people. It's along the way, the people who are coming here for economic betterment or to get out of a terrible situation in their home country are being taken advantage of. They're being raped, they're being sexually assaulted, they're being left for dead, they're being robbed blind, their families are being extorted by the cartels, and they're treated worse than animals, and it's some of the worst stuff you can imagine.
Yeah, I saw the Federalist had months ago had like a little expose on it, and they went down in these villages and talked to like pastors and priests who like pretty much the cartel. I guess these guys kind of know a lot of the cartel members since they were boys because they went to church there, so they give these guys a lot more than they would give anybody else. I mean, I think you can get your throat slit pretty easily, but if you're a priest for the village, so they interview these guys and they're talking about, and they said like the open board thing, like you said, is like it spurs like big business. Like they now have like barcodes and like number codes that you give when you get to the border, you give to that Mexican cartel member, and they verify that you've paid. Of course, it's never enough. It's like, well, you did pay the $7,000, but there's a $3,000 crossing that river fee, and if you try to cross it in front of me, I'm going to shoot you in the back, like that type of thing. It's super sad and messed up, man.
We would hit stash houses where you'd have 50 people in a house, and 2 toilets completely overflowing, and they're just basically being held there until their families pay up more money. And so that stuff it's commonplace, unfortunately.
It is terrifying to me, man. Mexico in general. I have buddies that go there to resorts. I'm like, I would never go there for vacation. I don't care how much armored guards they have at their resort. Like I had a friend that worked at, I forget the name of the police department. It was in Arizona, right? And they had a sister police department in Mexico, right over the line. And she sent me pictures of her sister police department, 2 cops at just a neighborhood intersection, and literally their head shot off, like shot so many times their heads were gone. These are like the crime scene pictures, and she said that's like our sister agency but Mexican. And if they don't play ball, because all these cops have families and everything else, and if you try to be righteous and not play ball, you might get your head shot off. Like
plata o plomo, as they say. You take the silver or take the lead. And we worked. I worked at a HIDTA task force in Brownsville for a while, and I started there in 2011. Now, 2010 it's considered like the most violent year of the drug war. Juarez, in particular, across from El Paso, was just carnage. I mean, it was worse than Iraq or Afghanistan at the time. And things were pretty calm in our area of the border until about 2010. When the Gulf Cartel, because the Gulf Cartel pretty much ran all of Tamaulipas and all the plazas along our section of the border. And everybody would pay the different pesos, the different fees to run through their plazas. And there was a fair amount of peace. They had their armed wing, which was known as the Zetas. And the Zetas basically when the head of the Gulf cartel got arrested and got extradited to the U.S., there was basically a power struggle, and it led to a civil war between the Zetas and the Gulf cartel. And then several factions within the Gulf cartel were fighting each other over control, over who was going to ascend to leadership. And it created tremendous chaos. We actually had, when I was working in McAllen, we had a guy. He was an engineer. He worked in one of the maquiladoras on the U.S. or on the Mexican side of the border. He was an American guy, and this happens a lot. People go down after NAFTA. They build all these factories on the Mexican side of the border where your cell phones are made, your cars are made, and so U.S. engineers will work in those factories and live on the U.S. side. And this guy was down there. He's from Colorado. He and his wife were out jet skiing on Falcon Lake, and the Zetas thought they were a rival smuggler, and they came with a boat and they gunned him down. He was killed. So this is an American guy who was killed right there. Several other incidents like that happened where Americans were trying to cross the border and got shot and killed. And so that was all happening as I was working down there. And it was very real. It wasn't getting the kind of coverage that obviously what was happening in Iraq or Afghanistan was getting, but it was just as hot of an area of the world at that time.
Absolutely. I mean, the next question I have for you is your most intense or terrifying call, but it sounds like they've all been pretty intense.
Most of them weren't, but life. Like I said, the most terrifying and intense thing was probably that kidnapping event. But there were plenty of them where you get called out for a shooting, you get called out for a not a barricaded suspect like that one, but a lot of those calls were in relation to an incident gone bad. Probably the next most terrifying thing was Border Patrol agents getting involved in a cross-border shooting where a smuggling event occurred, and as Border Patrol shows up to try to disrupt it, they start taking rounds from the Mexican side of the border. Now you've got an international incident.
Yeah.
They have to fire back, and they ended up shooting a guy in Mexico. And so that sort of stuff happened too. And you never took for granted when you were working a case and you had to be on the border, you were anywhere near the border. I don't fit in very well in the Rio Grande Valley,
I wouldn't either.
White skin.
Yeah.
I didn't do much UC work, and so you never took for granted that when you went into a space that everybody knew exactly who and what you were. And there was a period of time, again, 2010, 2011, 2012, where with the chaos happening on the Mexican side of the border, and as you described, cops getting killed left and right, we didn't know how far these guys were going to take it. And there was one incident that I was involved in where we arrested a Gulf cartel sicario in Brownsville. And we found out after the fact that this guy was, as the investigation proceeded, this guy was actually living in my neighborhood. For all intents and purposes, he looked like just the kind of guy who was, going to work every day like 99% of the people in my neighborhood. But finding out afterwards that there was literally a stone cold Gulf cartel killer living under a false identity a couple streets away from me was pretty incredible.
That's not cool, man. What's a sicario? Does that mean hitman or something?
Yeah, it means it's basically their terminology for one of their soldiers, one of their hitmen, and they're ruthless.
Yeah, I believe it. This might be a difficult one for you, Kristofor, but do you have a heartwarming encounter that you dealt with?
When I got off the border.
Okay.
So around 2000, so after that incident, the shooting and all that stuff, 2014 or so, my wife and I started looking at, like maybe moving off the border, transfer opportunities. And
I'm sure your wife was like, "We're getting the hell out of here."
Yeah, she grew up down there, but even she was like, "This is too much." Because that night, she didn't hear from me until 10 o'clock the next morning. And by then, of course, several of her friends who were married to Border Patrol agents were like, "Did you hear about the shooting?" And she's
oh, geez, my wife would be barfing.
Yeah, she'd had enough. But we moved off the border. But what kind of facilitated that was I got the opportunity to start working some fraud cases, some large scale fraud cases, and I got to work on some stuff that trended into elder fraud. So the biggest case I ever worked on was known as Operation Outsource. And if you ever got a call from someone saying, "This is the IRS, you owe us money, you pay money via gift cards," I investigated and ultimately took down the network behind that. And I got into that because before they started doing the IRS scam, these call centers were contacting people in the United States who were on H-1B visas, who were Indian nationals mostly, and threatening them before they realized, wait, we can threaten everyone in the country by saying we're the IRS. And so I started I started investigating it first because we thought maybe there was a DHS employee who had a list of visa holders who was maybe like extorting people. We thought it
Yeah.
was an internal affairs case. When I started working on it, it turned into this much like it was like scratching, it was like the tip of the iceberg, and so I ended up linking up with HSI and Secret Service and working this large scale investigation looking into these India based call centers that were scamming people by impersonating the US government. And along the course of that case, our team interviewed over 17,000 victims. And some of the most heartwarming things I did in my career was being able to recover money for
Yeah.
elderly victims of these
That's
scams.
great.
Getting a call from someone because I worked on that case for 7 years before we took it all down, and well, it
Was
was
there
actually
people?
about
So there
3
was
years.
people here working with people in India.
Yeah, so the call centers were based in India, and then they had a network of runners in the U.S., and their job was to um, basically launder the proceeds of the the fraud. So they would call
Okay.
somebody, say, "Hey, we got to take, $2,000 or $3,000. You're going to go to jail right away." People would go buy gift cards. They would scratch off the backs of the gift cards, load them with money, read them off to the callers. Then the callers would call their network of mules in the U.S. who were holding corresponding gift cards, and they would start loading money onto those, and they would go and buy money orders and deposit them into bank accounts. So it was a very quick transaction and turnover, but about half of the people, we ultimately indicted over 60 people, about half of them were in the U.S. as runners, the other half were operators of the call centers.
Bastards.
And we were able sometimes, because as word started to get out that I was investigating this, I'd have like a friend whose mom would get one of these calls and they'd lose $15,000 or $20,000, and they would call me and say, "Is there anything you can do? She just sent this money." And because of the network that my team had developed among, CVS, Walgreens, FedEx, UPS, all these different suppliers that these scammers were using in their scam, we were oftentimes able to stop those transfers on the not always, but often able to stop them as they were
Wow.
occurring and get that money back. And so, giving an old woman her life savings back, nothing beats that in my career. Nothing.
Yeah, that is great, man. Because as just a local cop, we feel powerless all the time because
Yes.
most of the time we just get calls to the station where people are like, I just want to let you know this happened. I didn't give them anything, and it's like you did the right thing, perfect. Because I get 10 to 15 phishing emails a week myself that are
Yeah.
either threatening me or telling me they have video of me doing stuff because I went on a porn site and I'm like, I know that's not true. Like, so,
Yeah.
but depending what the scam is, people, and we've even had people used AI, and an elderly woman got a call from her granddaughter's voice. So, but then she called her at work and she's like, "I'm at work. I didn't just call you." And she's like, "Oh, okay." But they're pretty elaborate. And we've had people send money overseas, like wire it. And they will give you instructions. Like when you go to the bank, there's a possibility the bank is in on this. So they're going to give you some direction to not to do this. Kind of like saying like, they're going to say we're scammers, but they are. And then they go in and they actually wire 50, 75 grand to a Swiss account. And it's like, at that point, I don't even know what to do with it. It's like, that's gone. That's wired money to Switzerland. And some of the higher money ones like that, the FBI actually has been interested in. But if you're talking like below 20 grand, I think the federal guys are just too busy. Like they can't, if they took all those calls, they'd need 100,000 employees.
Well, the way it worked was, so the initial calls that I got were from like Houston area police departments would have someone walk in, like an H-1B visa holder who was living in Houston would say, "Hey, I got the call," and I sent them. It was typically less than $3,000, and at the time they were using like Green Dot gift cards as their primary laundering mechanism. And you could only load so much onto those cards without it triggering like a flag or a warning in the system.
Right.
And so what they would do is they would load several victims' cash onto those cards from different phone calls. And so I would get the subpoena back and I would look at it and would say, "Okay, I've got my victim, but who else loaded money onto this?" And I'd start calling and connecting with other victims. And when I brought it to the U.S. Attorney's Office, that was exactly what they said. They're like, "Show me $100,000," because these were like
Right.
small transactions. And I was like, "What if I show you a network that's doing this?" And what we realized pretty quickly, if you want to know more about this, Sony Music made a podcast about this case. It's called Chameleon Scam Likely. It's an 8-part serial podcast. It was like one of the top 10 podcasts of 2022.
Wow.
And it explains all of it. But we basically found that there were a handful of phone numbers these guys were using to confirm deposits. And once we connected that, we were able to go to the card providers and say, I want every single card that this telephone number called and asked about. And then we had a list of millions of dollars of transactions. And then it became a game of how do we identify the mules, and how do we figure out, how do we shorten the timeline from subpoena to information? How do we develop the relationships with the people at MoneyGram and Wells Fargo and the different grocery stores where these guys were making those purchases of MoneyGram and Wells Fargo? How do we develop contacts where I can tell somebody, I don't have 6 weeks to wait to get this information back, because in that 6 weeks, thousands more people are going to be scammed. I need to know when this guy walks in. I need to have someone I can call and say, go get me a license plate, right? And so the game became about how do we get the names and information of these mostly illegal immigrants from India who are facilitating the money laundering. And that became the fun part of the investigation. We ended up, like I said, we did a single day takedown in October of 2016 where we arrested 25 people domestically. We still have over 30 people, I think, in India that have outstanding warrants that haven't been extradited or turned over and may never be. It just depends on diplomatic pressures and all that stuff that's way above my pay grade.
Right.
But we were able to ultimately identify and stop a significant number of these people. They just unfortunately changed their tactics, and like they use things like AI, and they're always going to adjust to what we know. And we were hopeful that a big head strike like that was going to take out the network and was going to really expose the scam. But the takedown happened about a week before the 2016 election, and it sort of got lost in the news cycle.
That sucks. Dude, you're my hero. I have to say, Kristofor, you are my hero. I hate these pricks that take the money from the old people. I hate them. A lot of these old people own their house. They did everything right, and they just have a little nest egg left that they can easily live off of, leave the house to the kids, and have a little cash to give them, and they take that from them, and it drives me insane. I hate dealing with it.
I had victims who lost $200,000. I mean, I had, and the worst ones are when this was probably, without naming names, I'll kind of describe the situation. I had the elderly victim in Florida, and she got a phone call. They changed their kind of approach to how they did this. After we took down what was known as the IRS scam, they turned it into a Social Security Administration scam. And it went through the roof in 2020 because what did we tell everybody? Stay away from your elderly relatives for safety's sake. Everybody stay home, save lives, right? And so individuals during the pandemic, 2020, 2021, were isolated. Our boomer parents and grandparents were isolated, and they were stuck, and they were lonely, and they're answering the phone. And people are calling and telling them, hey, this is the FBI or this is the DEA. Your social security number has been used in a drug smuggling event in El Paso.
Right.
And, we need you to close down your bank account, pull all your money out, send it to us. We're going to hold it in a secure federal lockbox until we can issue you a new social security number. Well, what's the lifeline for most elderly folks? Their social security number, right? They get terrified, and they've got they don't have their kids around. They can't talk to anybody. They're isolated, and they take these calls and they're like, oh my gosh. And then meanwhile, the scammer is saying, you're really going to be helping us with this case because we're going to be able to continue the operation using your old social security number. We're going to get to the whole network. And so, we really appreciate you doing this, yada, yada, yada. So they were going out and they were taking, like I said, in this one case, $200,000 worth of cash, entire life savings, everything that this woman had, putting it into boxes and sending them to CVS stores or Walgreens stores where they have those UPS or FedEx drop ship locations where you can basically send a box and someone can come in and pick it up so it's not sitting out on your porch. Guys would go in with fake IDs. They'd say, send it to Special Agent so-and-so. And it'd be, an Indian guy would go in with a fake ID that said, an Illinois driver's license that said, Tom Smith or whatever. They look at the ID, they pick up the box, and he walks out and he's got $50,000 cash. And we started seeing that happen just at a massive scale during 2020 and 2021. And that really pissed me off because that was when I started to see victims that weren't just losing, not like any loss. It leaves you feeling violated. Getting scammed by a telescammer is no different in a lot of ways from a psychological perspective than getting mugged on the street, right?
Yeah.
You lose something of value. You lose trust in yourself. You look over your shoulder a lot more.
Yep.
It psychologically impacts you in the same way to be the victim of a scam or the victim of a crime of violence. But when you start seeing $3,000, $5,000, $15,000 jump up to $200,000, jump up to this 70-year-old woman has no way to pay her bills, has to mortgage her home or sell her home, it just makes you like livid beyond the point where you can even think straight sometimes.
Yeah, I mean they're taking in a lot of ways like they're taking advantage of the innocent. Like they're so innocent that they think they're actually falling for this stuff. They have no idea. They're just, I a lot of times I don't know, some of the ones I've dealt with I don't understand how it happened. And I've had like husbands come in and they kind of stand behind their wives as she's giving the report, and the husband's behind her like listening to her and what she went through to get the money overseas, and the husband is like, he was at work.
Yeah.
And he's just like, I can't believe you did this. But they're just they're not, they've had a good life. They've not had a lot of adversity. They think people are good. There's a lot of things that go into the equation that makes the perfect victim, and it seems to be elderly people, a lot of times living rurally, like that type of thing.
They took a lot of advantage of recent widows and widowers too.
Which is
the
sick.
average age of my victims in these cases was 73, and you would be shocked to learn that a lot of my victims were nurses or doctors or people that you would think, higher levels of education. Like you would think like, oh, these are the kind of people who'd never fall for this. No, they fall for it at a higher degree. But a lot of people who are widows or widowers, because there's a lot of public information that gets put out there when a person dies, and they seem to target and focus on people who were emotionally compromised, because that made them more likely to not have the mental acuity to think straight about a situation like that, and they didn't necessarily have someone to talk to. Because they were, the person that might have been, laying in bed next to him saying, hey, that doesn't sound right, that sounds fishy, isn't there anymore to bounce that idea off of, right? And they're especially lonely, so they're more likely to answer the phone and stay on the phone and stay engaged. And to feel like they're helping someone is important to them, because a lot of times, I've seen this in my own family when people lose a loved one after 40 or 50 years of marriage, you kind of don't have an anchor. Right. Yeah. And so somebody coming and saying, you're going to be helping us to stop bad guys, it becomes an anchor point, and that person becomes important to you. And so we saw that like crazy 2020, 2021, 2022. I've probably put in my career, after Operation Outsource, where we did that big takedown, probably another 15 or 20 guys in various spin-off investigations. So these people can be arrested. If you work for a local PD and you're listening to this, take advantage of those databases that the FTC runs, the Sentinel database. No matter how trivial it seems, if somebody comes in and makes one of these reports, take as much data as you can, the phone number, the names used, all of that stuff, because a lot of times they repeat this stuff. They're using voice over IP, but they might use the same number for a week or 2 weeks. A lot of times they might use the same name again and again in their script. And so, for me, in one of my cases, the name Steve Marsh kept coming up. And I was like, okay, that's kind of a calling card. I can search the FTC database for other reports with that name as a keyword, and I can find other victims that I can link in, and I can create a big case that the U.S. Attorney's Office needs. So report those things. Don't let them die on the intel desk of your local PD. Make sure those go up to the FTC. Make sure those go up to FBI has their LEAP database. Make sure these things go up to the databases that help guys like me who are looking at things from a federal perspective see the big picture. Because what you're seeing in your town, you might be saying, there's nothing I can do about this because this is clearly international. It crosses international boundaries. Right. My department's not going to spend the time or the money trying to track this down. These guys are in different states or different countries. Somebody, I promise you, at a federal level is looking at that database and is trying to, you might be seeing your piece of the elephant, and someone else might be seeing their piece of the elephant. Someone like me might be looking at the whole elephant. So give us all the data that you can.
That's very heartening, man, because we do tell people to hit the FTC and report it, and then through Nespin. You're from New England, but I don't know if you ever worked law enforcement, but Nespin
I didn't work law enforcement there. No.
Okay, so Nespin is the New England State Police Information Network, whatever. But when you have a membership to that, it gives you all kinds of. It has like pawn records on there, but it has all those federal databases where you can go in and enter incidents of, email fraud. and it just kind of goes into it's probably the directory you're talking about. I just don't remember the name of it, but I can enter them into the right directory, and it kind of goes into the pool where now people can query similarities and, like you said, try to put a case together. And maybe down the road at some point there might be some restitution. Who knows? I mean, if it gets big enough, I'm sure it gets more attention, right?
Yeah. So our case, ultimately, that big one that I did, was a $300 million scam case that we know of. And we estimate
Gosh.
that maybe 1% to 2% of victims are actually reporting that they became victimized. Because if you think about most of these people, like, you lose $30,000, you're not going to tell your kids. You
Yeah, it's
don't want them to
embarrassing
know.
too. Yeah.
It's embarrassing, right?
Yep.
So you're almost being victimized a second time by telling your story. So the vast majority of people just like sat on that information. And so it's 300 million that we know of. It's 17,000 victims that we know of. We assume that number is far, far higher and far, far greater, just for that small window of time, that 3-year period of time where we were pulling information and putting the case together. And then in the years afterwards, it's only gotten more and more, like I said, during the pandemic. And it's just something that doesn't get enough attention. Elder fraud strike forces weren't set up in this country at a federal level until like 2018, 2019, 2020. And they're not really they're not really heavily funded. And so,
Right.
it's something where elderly folks in this country, they vote, they let their voices be heard. They need to be letting Congress know and their elected officials know that this is a massive crime that is focused on elderly victims, and that they want federal resources dedicated to fighting this crime. And that's how you get more of these people arrested.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know there is in community centers and stuff like that, and council and aging centers. There is a lot more little talks given, like, "Hey, come by today. There's going to be a DA there. There's going to be a local cop there, and they're going to talk to you about." That's very helpful, because then, at very least, like you said, even if they're isolated, or they're a widower or a widow, they at least then will call the police department and ask us what we think before they do anything, which is that's half the battle. Just don't let the cat out of the bag. Don't let the funds go. Don't do anything like that until you call somebody.
We spent a lot of time educating banks, a lot of time educating, we worked with Walmart and Target and other places where these gift cards get sold, to explain what was going on and see what they could do to train their employees working at the customer service desk, things to look for if someone comes in and they won't hang up their phone and they're buying these cards. So we've done a lot to try to mitigate and prevent. The podcast was a big part of that. Putting out that 8-part podcast, it gives people a resource that they can then share with their loved one. If you've got an elderly loved one and you want to make sure they don't fall for this stuff, share Chameleon Scam Likely with them. Just send them that podcast, say, listen to this.
Yeah.
This is going to explain what can happen with these sort of calls. And so education's been a big part of it. Unfortunately, we just can't touch everyone.
I had one where the lady actually was on the phone at the bank, and the teller did the right thing and said, because the woman told me when she was reporting it, the teller actually told her, "Ma'am, I don't want to get into your personal business, but if you're on the phone with somebody about this money, it's a large amount of money, I feel like you might be getting scammed." And she said, "No, this is Officer so-and-so from my local police department. He's helping me. Give me my money." And the banker was like, "Okay," gave it to her. And then when I was interviewing the lady, super nice lady, and I felt so sorry for her. And I said, did he, because we have a very small town, so there, you could know every officer in town easily. And I go, did he have an accent? And she goes, "Well, yeah, he had, she said, "Well, first of all, we don't do isms in our household," meaning racism, everything else. And I go, "I understand, but what was the accent?" And she said, "Indian." And I said, "What was his name?" And she told me his name. And I said, "Do you know any local police officers with that name?" And she's like, "Now that I think about it, no." I said, "Are any local police officers look Indian?" "No." And I'm like, you're not being racist when you're protecting yourself from a foreign person calling you, because now we see what happened. She, of course, she was like, "Yeah, you're right." But she was almost so nice and so PC that helped her to lose her money. It was unbelievable. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, boomers are a more trusting generation. People did, business over the phone.
Right.
People would call and it's just different. Like, I say the people who are least likely to fall for this, and we were kind of having a Gen X talk earlier, people least likely to fall for this are the most cynical, and that's our generation.
Right.
The victims were either 70 plus for the most part, or were below the age of 30. And the reason being, the people below the age of 30 were much more comfortable with the idea of buying a gift card to pay their taxes. Because sure,
Right.
we're in a modern world. That maybe that's how the IRS does things, right? And
Right.
people above a certain age are more trusting, with people calling them on the phone because they live in that pre 9/11 mindset where the world was a much more innocent place. And in between, you've got this big group of Gen X who are like, hang up, or they
Yeah.
like mess with the people or whatever. And
Right.
and
That's my money.
and those are some of the best resources for reporting. Those are the guys who would get the most information out of the callers and turn it back over to us.
Yeah.
And be like, yeah, I told the guy to take a hike or whatever, but after I messed with him for a while, and I'm like, all right, that's what I want, because
Yeah.
those voice over IP lines cost money, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, you keep them on the phone and you mess with them, that hurts them in their
I love
pocketbook.
those
So
videos, dude. You see those scammer videos when they find out where the call
yeah.
center is, and they're like,
we
"Oh,
we work
hello."
with some of those guys. Yeah,
Like,
we
hello,
work with some of
Ganesh.
those guys.
Well, that's not my name. My name is Peter. And he's like, no, this is your real name. And he's looking around the call center like, who the hell am I talking to? That is unbelievable. They get their cameras. Like, I don't even know if it's legal what they're doing, but I don't care.
Depends where they are. But yeah, no, we've been able to establish. I don't want to say partnerships because they do something different than we do, but when there's
1:15, had a little freeze here.
intelligence that they get.
You just totally froze there at like for the last 15 seconds, just so you know. I wrote it down.
Well, what I was going to tell you is there's a fair amount of intelligence that gets generated by those guys. As fun as it is on those videos, they're also able to sometimes provide intelligence to our people that can be acted on. So we've actually been able to make some arrests based on information that they've provided about where those call centers are directing people in the states to pick up cash.
I love it, man. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. I love that whole thing. It's so good. So last question for you. I've had you over an hour here, so I know your time is valuable. But we have one more question, and I want to talk about your book too.
Sure.
Advice to new people getting into law enforcement.
Do it for the right reasons. Like I joined after 9/11. I had no interest in going into law enforcement, and then I saw the heroics on 9/11 and totally changed my career path because of it. So, and for me, like, obviously I didn't end up fighting terrorists as I thought was going to be what I did, but I wanted to be in immigration law enforcement because the people who attacked us came from a foreign country and overstayed the visas that they came on. So that's why I went to work for ICE, was to try to stop that from happening again. As long as you have mission, task, and purpose, you're going to be on the right path. If you're doing this because, it's good benefits or it's good pay or whatever, you're going to be disgruntled and unhappy. So make sure you know your mission, task, and purpose and follow it.
All right. Words of wisdom. I love it. In Valor, 365 Stoic meditations for first responders. Can you just tell us what Stoicism is a little bit and your connection to it?
Yeah, so Stoicism is a philosophy that's kind of considered a lived philosophy. A lot of times we think about philosophy, we think about, beard stroking, academic, scholastic pursuits. Stoicism has gotten very popular in the last few years, but it's been around since about the late Hellenistic period, right after the death of Alexander the Great. It was kind of a school of philosophy that was founded out of chaotic times. And the basic precept of it is control what is within your control. The whole idea of the dichotomy of control is there are things that are external to us and there are things that are internal to us. What we control is our actions, our reactions, our attitudes, our efforts. Everything else is external. And, we kind of have to give up trying to control the external. And that can be very, very hard for police and for law enforcement who want to calm every scene and want to control every angle and always want to be the last voice heard. And what I found was that by focusing on the things that were within my control in my career and not getting wrapped up and caught up in the external, I was able to have a much more effective career and was able to take care of my mental health a lot better as well. And so for me, especially when I was going through things like that shooting that we talked about, or putting my boss in jail, blowing the whistle on, somebody who could end your career.
A little stressful.
it comes with some consequences. People further up the chain don't like that stuff when you're, testifying against, someone in your own agency. That sort of stuff had the potential to really derail my mental health. And that was when I really started leaning into Stoicism as a philosophy. I picked up a copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
I was just going to say that.
Rome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had read that in my college Philosophy 101 class, and I remembered some great advice from it, and had some conversations with my dad as all that was going on, as I was telling him what was happening in my office. And he basically he parroted some things back to me that reminded me of Marcus Aurelius. And I said, I got to go pick that up again, because there was some great advice in there. This was a guy who was the emperor of Rome during a time of war and plague and pestilence. He was dealing with, all these terrible things all the time. And he really leaned in this philosophy to keep his head right.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time I see one of his quotes come up on like social media or something like that, they always hit home. It's always like, wow, that's wise.
Yeah.
Words of wisdom.
So I really I got into it, and it really helped me keep my head on straight and keep my focus while I was going through some tough times in my career. And when I left my career, I said, if I could give anything back to new people or people who are just getting in, we talk more in law enforcement now about mental health and focus on mental health. But this isn't stuff that is really talked about at the academy. As far as I know, I taught it, at our federal academy, and I never remember that being something that was brought up. And there's a lot of guys out there who talk about what to do after, you've made mistakes or done things and screwed things up. What I wanted to try to do was give back to people something that they could use every day as a touch point to help them stay on track and not get off track. And that's what Stoicism was for me.
So it looks like there's one for every day in here. There's an entry in here for every single. Is that the way the book's supposed to be used?
Exactly. So the book is 365 entries. Each entry has a quote from one of the Stoics, either Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Zeno, Kristofor, all these different guys from 2,000 years ago who had just some incredible insight on the human condition. I take a quote from one of them so that you don't have to go back and read these thick volumes of Greek and Roman philosophy.
Yeah.
You can pick this up if you're a cop, and in about 15 minutes or less, you can read a quote from one of the Stoics. I put it into modern context. I try to contextualize it based on what you might be dealing with in your career and seeing on a day-to-day basis. I use modern stories to illustrate the point that the philosopher is making.
Very cool.
And give you a different way to think about it. And then at the end of each one, I have a journal prompt or an action item to give you something to do that can help you practice that precept that day. And there's one for every day of the year. And if you do this every single day and you read the quote, read the contextualization, do the journal prompt, I guarantee you from a mental health perspective, you're going to have, if nothing else, you're going to have some more tools in your tool belt to help you deal with the frustrating, stressful situations that you cannot control. You're going to have some things that remind you, hey, I don't control this, but I control how I react to this. I don't control the external, but I can focus on how I act in reaction to this. I can live in accordance with the cardinal virtues of wisdom, of courage, of temperance, of justice. I can make that my guiding hallmark. That can be my mission, task, and purpose, as it were. And this book is going to help you focus on those things that you do control.
It's awesome. It's available on Amazon. Anywhere else?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you get your books, you can pick up a copy.
Yeah, I saw you had all 5-star on Amazon, man. So it's doing well.
Yeah. I think my dad gave me 5 stars. No, it's been great. I've really enjoyed. I've gone on a bunch of podcasts to talk about it. I've really enjoyed sharing it. And if you're not into reading, I have a podcast that I do called the Stoic Responder, where I do basically the same thing. They're 15 to 20 minute long episodes. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. I basically give you a Stoic quote, some contextualization, and a journal prompt. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to sit down and do a journal entry or read for 15 minutes, but maybe you've got 15 minutes on your drive to work to listen, you can pick up, you can tune into my podcast and get the same sort of information.
I didn't know you had a podcast, brother. Stoic Responder?
Stoic Responder, yeah.
All right, let me, I don't know where that came from. Did you hear that at all?
I heard a siren, yeah.
I think my podcast automatically started. Oh, I just found it. I just want to throw the graphic up there for people. I wasn't prepared, and I want people to see it so they know what to look for.
Sure.
Let me see. This is on the fly. I'm very technologically advanced. I do screen grabs, and then it just puts it anywhere it wants to on my. There it is. Here's the Stoic responder right here.
Oh, nice.
Nice. Perfect. Yeah. So, Kristofor, I will put a link in the show notes right at the top for your book, of course, Amazon link to the book, and a link to your podcast so people can easily find you there. Also, at Team Healey on Instagram, it's at team_Healey, Healey. So go follow you there. Absolute honor to have you on, man. Fantastic stories. Thank you so much for taking the time, brother.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. I'm going to do the outro to the show. Can you hang on for just like 2 or 3 minutes?
You got it.
All right. The great Kristofor Healey, everybody. Fascinating stories. Really cool. Thank you to him for coming on. This is the time in the show where I thank the Patreon sponsors. If you really love the show and you want to show me some love and help support what I'm doing here, you can do that through the Patreon link in the show notes. There's a bunch of different levels, but if you choose Sergeant or above, you will get a shout out on the Things Police See podcast. Who I'm talking about is these are the lieutenants, ladies and gentlemen. The great and powerful Andy Biggs, new Lieutenant Michael Roach from Roach Machines. Thank you, sir. Check him out. AI Solutions. The great and powerful Thomas Connell, Lieutenant level. Now to the sergeants. Adam Alexander, the great Adam McMahon, Adam Mihal, everybody. Ben Peters, Bentley Barnett, thank you, sir. The great Brad Thompson, Dan Carlson from Burley Boards, great woodworker. Check him out on Instagram. Sherry Finch, thank you, Madame. Clark LaCuff, everybody. Dave Ellman, Dennis Carrasquillo, Doug and Kelly Newman, love you guys. Hope you're enjoying Wyoming. Dylan Mosher, the great Elliot Sykes. Gary Steiner, the great George Cariotis, everybody. Greg Gadboy, James Rose, the great Jason Labrie. Jason Lau, none other than the great Jason Lau, everybody. John Jordan, John Shoemaker, John and Eric Kate, love you guys. See you at church. Kyle Roberts, Lauren Stimson, everybody. The handsome Lane Campbell, the great Lisa Gano, Iceman from Motor Cop Chronicles, check out his podcast. Nancy Hammond, everybody. The great Nick Adams. Past guest Paul Maloney, love you, buddy. Great episode, check his out. Sergeant Raymond Arsenal, oh, thank you, sir. The great Richard Tolles, keep on trucking, brother, be safe out there. Sasha McNabb, everybody. Scott Young, Sean Clifford, Seth Wright, Sheriff Ronald Long, thank you, Sheriff. Tammy Walsh, the great Tammy Walsh, holding it down at dispatch, thank you, Tammy. The great Tony Fahey, William James Long, that's Deputy William James Long, to you, thank you very much. Zachary Pleat, and the great George Chessier, love you, buddy, see you at church. Thank you, guys. The list is long, and I appreciate it. If you really love the show, do that at Patreon, and I will see you guys next week.